The ambulance sat motionless behind a locked steel gate for 6 minutes before I got there. 6 minutes I didn't know about until later. 6 minutes that felt. Once I finally understood the full timeline, like the longest 6 minutes of my entire life, even though I hadn't personally lived through a single second of them. My name is Desmond Aldrich. I'm 56 years old, and my wife Corrine has a heart condition that's required careful monitoring for the better part of a decade, well managed most days. But occasionally, without much warning, capable of turning into exactly the kind of emergency that makes every single second between a call to dispatch and an ambulance actually reaching our driveway matter more than almost anything else in the world. We live at the end of a private gravel road, roughly a third of a mile long, that my own father built with his own equipment back in 1979, connecting our house to the county highway. That road runs directly past the entrance to a gated development called Hollow Ridge Estates, built nearly 2 decades after my father graded that first stretch of gravel. And for the entire time Hollow Ridge has existed, its homeowners association has operated under the belief that the road serving both our properties belonged, in some meaningful sense, to them. I want to explain the history here clearly, because it matters enormously to everything that happened the afternoon Corrine's heart went into the kind of arrhythmia that required immediate emergency transport. My father purchased the parcel our house sits on in 1974 and built the gravel access road himself 5 years later, well before Hollow Ridge Estates was ever more than an idea in some developers' planning documents. When that development finally broke ground in the late 1990s, the developer approached my father directly, requesting permission to use the existing road as the development's own primary access, rather than building an entirely separate entrance road at considerably greater expense. My father agreed, on the condition that a proper recorded easement be established, granting Hollow Ridge residents a right of use for ingress and egress, while explicitly preserving the road's underlying ownership as our own family property. That easement was properly filed with the county, and I inherited both the road and the house upon my father's death 11 years ago. The same clean, unambiguous ownership structure that had governed the arrangement since the very beginning. I want to be clear about something that matters considerably to what happened later. That easement grants Hollow Ridge residents the right to use the road for normal ingress and egress. It grants the homeowners association itself no authority whatsoever to install gates, restrict access, or impose any kind of control over who uses that road or under what conditions, particularly not conditions that could delay or prevent emergency services from reaching either my own house or any Hollow Ridge property beyond it. The gate itself had gone up about 3 years before the ambulance incident, installed by the Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association under a board led by a woman named Priscilla Ainsworth, who had held the presidency for just over 4 years by that point. I want to be honest that I'd raised concerns about that gate installation from the very beginning, contacting Priscilla directly to point out that nothing in the recorded easement authorized any physical barrier controlling access to a road my family owned outright. "Mr. Aldrich," she told me at the time, "the gate is simply a security measure for our residents. You'll have a code, the same as everyone else. It won't affect your own access in any meaningful way." I want to note that this assurance turned out to be considerably less reliable than it sounded during that initial conversation. Over the following 3 years, the gate's access code changed periodically, sometimes with proper advance notice to households outside the Hollow Ridge development like my own, and sometimes, as I would eventually discover, without any notice reaching me at all. I want to describe the afternoon itself in careful detail, because the sequence of events mattered enormously to everything that followed. Corrine called emergency dispatch herself, still conscious, but experiencing chest pain and irregular heartbeat severe enough that she recognized immediately it required more than our own home monitoring equipment could safely manage. Dispatch logged the call at 2:14 in the afternoon, and an ambulance was dispatched within minutes from a station roughly 11 minutes away under normal driving conditions. I was at my own workshop, a small metal fabrication business I run about 20 minutes from our house, when Corine's call came through to my own cell phone, and I left immediately, though I want to be honest that I had no idea during my own drive home that the ambulance itself had already encountered a problem I couldn't have anticipated. The ambulance reached the Hollow Ridge Gate at 2:23, according to the dispatch log I obtained later, and found the gate closed with the access code the crew had on file, the same code that had worked for every previous emergency call to any Hollow Ridge address, no longer functioning. The gate's code had been changed 4 days earlier, as part of what Priscilla Ainsworth would later describe as a routine quarterly security update, without notice reaching either the county's emergency dispatch system or my own household. I want to describe what I learned about those 6 minutes, because piecing together the actual sequence became one of the more important parts of everything that followed. The ambulance crew, unable to open the gate, attempted to contact dispatch for an alternate code, a process that itself consumed nearly 2 minutes given the layers of communication required between the ambulance, county dispatch, and whatever Hollow Ridge contact information existed on file. Dispatch, in turn, attempted to reach the Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association's own emergency contact number, which connected to Priscilla Ainsworth's cell phone directly, and which she did not answer for the first 3 attempts. I arrived at the gate myself at 2:29, having driven considerably faster than I probably should have, and found the ambulance sitting motionless on the far side of a locked gate, lights flashing, crew visibly frustrated, with my own wife sitting inside our house, alone, in genuine medical distress, while a barrier that had no legal authority to exist in the first place stood between her and the emergency care she needed. I want to note that I don't carry the gate's access code myself. On principle, having refused for 3 years to participate in a system I'd always considered an unauthorized overreach against my own property rights. I climbed out of my truck, retrieved a heavy set of bolt cutters I keep for exactly this kind of situation, precisely because I had anticipated, given the gate's history of code changes and communication failures, that a moment like this might eventually arrive, and cut through the gate's chain myself, waving the ambulance through immediately. Corrine was stabilized at the hospital within the hour, and I want to be honest that the medical outcome, thankfully, did not turn tragic, though the attending physician later told me plainly that arrhythmia events of the specific type she'd experienced can, in a meaningful percentage of cases, become life-threatening within a window measured in single-digit minutes rather than anything longer. Those 6 minutes the ambulance sat locked outside a gate that had no legal right to exist represented exactly the kind of margin that separates a manageable medical event from a genuine catastrophe. I called an attorney the following morning, a careful, methodical woman named Perpetua Alderidge, who I'd used for other property matters over the years involving the road easement. I laid out the full timeline, the recorded easement, the unauthorized gate, the code change without proper notice, and the 6 minutes my wife spent waiting for emergency care behind a barrier the Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association had never possessed any legal authority to install in the first place. This goes well beyond a simple easement dispute, Perpetua told me once she'd reviewed everything. An association restricting access to a road they don't own, in a manner that directly delayed emergency medical response, creates significant liability exposure, particularly given that you'd already raised concerns about exactly this kind of scenario when the gate was first installed 3 years ago. I want to explain what emerged once Perpetua's formal records request to the association produced the gate's complete access log and code change history. The code had, in fact, been changed 6 times over the 3 years since installation, and in 4 of those 6 instances, no advance notice had been provided to my own household, despite my property sitting entirely beyond the gate and depending on functioning access for exactly this kind of emergency scenario. More troubling still, Perpetua's request revealed that Priscilla Ainsworth had received, roughly 8 months before the ambulance incident, a formal complaint from a Hollow Ridge resident regarding a separate incident where a fire department vehicle had experienced a similar delay, reaching a house fire within the development itself, an incident that fire department records confirmed had resulted in additional property damage directly attributable to the delayed access. That complaint had been addressed internally, according to board meeting minutes Perpetua obtained, with a promise to improve emergency contact protocols. A promise that, based on what happened to my own wife 8 months later, had never actually been properly implemented. I want to be fair and note that Priscilla Ainsworth's own explanation, once formally questioned, didn't suggest deliberate malice toward my wife specifically. The gate's code changes were handled through a rotating quarterly schedule managed by a board committee, and the notification failures appeared to stem from a genuinely disorganized internal process rather than any specific intent to endanger my household. That explanation, however sincere, didn't change the underlying seriousness of what had actually happened. An association operating a physical barrier on a road they had no legal authority to control, using a notification system that had already failed once before with documented consequences, and failing a second time with considerably more dangerous results. The Hollow Ridge Board held an emergency session once the full timeline became public knowledge throughout the development, and I attended alongside Perpetua, along with the resident whose house fire had been delayed 8 months earlier, a man named Terrence Whitfield who'd never fully understood, until hearing about my wife's incident, that his own experience had been part of a pattern rather than an isolated failure. Priscilla attempted to open the meeting by characterizing both incidents as unfortunate but unrelated communication failures. But a board member named Cassius Delgado, who'd served alongside her for over a year, asked the question that seemed to capture the room's collective alarm. "How many other emergency vehicles," he asked, "have been delayed at that gate that we simply never heard about because the resident involved didn't happen to connect it to anything or didn't survive long enough to ask the question?" Nobody in that room had a complete answer to that question that evening. The board voted that same night to remove the gate entirely, restoring the road to the same open access configuration it had maintained for the nearly 2 decades before the gate was ever installed, and to formally acknowledge, in writing, that the association held no legal authority over the underlying road ownership in the first place. Priscilla resigned from the board within the month, and Cassius stepped in as interim president, commissioning a full review of the development's emergency access protocols with direct input from the county fire department and emergency dispatch, ensuring nothing similar could recur regardless of whatever gate or security system Hollow Ridge might eventually choose to install in the future. Corrine has fully recovered, and continues her regular monitoring appointments the same way she has for the past decade. Though I'll admit neither of us has fully shaken the particular fear that settled into us both once we understood exactly how close those 6 minutes came to mattering considerably more than they ultimately did. The road out to our house sits open now, exactly the way my father intended it when he first agreed to share it with a development he could never have imagined would eventually try to control land that had never belonged to them. I still keep those bolt cutters in my truck, though I hope genuinely never to need them again for anything more serious than clearing brush. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether your own HOA has ever restricted access in a way that could put someone's safety at real risk. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.